So you're the one who's been asking the most complicated questions. Yeah, you're going to have to eat the mic.
This is better?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Are we good?
They want to move the chairs forward, Devin.
Sorry, thank you.
It's all right. Awesome.
All right, I think...
Ooh, we get more questions.
More questions. Yes,
We'll
if you have a
time
question...
Also, if you don't have one, you can come to the mic at the end once we get through the written questions. Thank you, Beth.
Okay, are we good?
Good to go. We're on.
Good. Awesome. So thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you for an amazing sermon, very thought-provoking. I have been in church for pretty much my entire life, and these parables get told kind of one way and one way only, and to stray from that is kind of, it's unheard of, kind of, where I come from. So I'm grateful for the challenge. I guess I will start with my own questions.
Yeah, of course. Then, that's why you're up here.
Yeah, and then dive into the ones that we got. So you named Octavia Butler's work about the parable of the sower. And I guess the question that I was thinking, was how close do you think we are to being in that kind of economic apocalypse? And is there kind of a clear way to turn this around? It seems like we are in a moment of crisis.
Yeah.
And there doesn't really seem a clear way to get out of it at this point. So I'm curious, how close you think we are to this kind of vision that she had.
Well, I don't think we're all the way to what Butler's dystopian reality is, thank God. But I do think we're in a dystopian reality. And I think one of the things we have to do as people of faith is to make sure that we can name the moment we're in. And some people describe that as exegeting the times or discerning the times. You may have heard people say that. Part of the work, Thomas Merton talks about this, that part of the work of being a follower of Jesus is not only to know who you are, but to know who you are in the time that you're in. So if you don't understand the time that you're in, it doesn't matter if you understand who you are, because you won't be fit for the time. And if you know the time that you're in, but you don't know who you are, you won't be able to rise to the occasion. So the work of faith is to do that deep work of understanding who we are, beloved creatures in the image of God, but also all of our, failings and things that can go wrong about ourselves that we need to work on, but also what time it is, right? And so you'll hear people talk about the doomsday clock is at midnight, and they talk, nuclear war, or we're in a dystopian reality. We're living in a moment of crisis. And we are in a moment of crisis. We don't yet have roving extremist groups going into neighborhoods, capturing people that they disagree with and putting them in the concentration camps. That's a part of Butler's novel. But what we saw on January 6th could be foreshadowing. I've talked about the sheriffs deputizing people in their towns, and that idea. It's being talked about. So how close are we? I'd say we're pretty close. And the economic situation, to go back to kind of the framing of the question around economics, I think we're really close economically to an even bigger catastrophe than we can imagine, bigger than the housing crisis of a few years ago. Right now, the disparity between the rich and the poor is so wide that it's the widest ever in American history. The gap is so great, even worse than before the Great Depression, even worse than the 20s. I mean, it's worse than it ever has been. And that's causing people who ordinarily would not be in a precarious situation to be in a very precarious financial situation. And so I heard yesterday, I was listening to a podcast about housing, and one of the things that really struck me about it was this is about Los Angeles, but it could be said of Charlotte. Every 5% increase in rent, average across the city, for every 5% increase in rent, 2,000 people become housing insecure. I'm going to say that again. For every 5% increase in rent, 2,000 people become housing insecure. So I think sometimes we're not thinking about how precarious this situation is. 5% doesn't seem like a lot, and the rents in Charlotte are just skyrocketing through the roof as they keep building more and more apartments and And it doesn't seem like there's an end to the skyrocketing rates. And the reason that that's a problem is because wages are not rising at the same pace. So wages have been almost stagnant for like 25 years, more than that. And especially when you count it for inflation, wages are very stagnant. So now you're basically paying people the same you were paying them 20 years ago, but the price of housing has gone through the roof. And that's why you see tent cities during the pandemic, and that's why there's so many people on the side. I don't know if you've noticed, you're driving around Charlotte, there's more people out asking for money on the corners. More women than I've ever seen before. Not men, not just men, but women, families. This is a result of the continued increase in housing prices and real estate speculation, but no wage increases, right? And there's no mandatory minimum wage. There's no unions to fight for it, especially in the South. Who's protecting the workers? Who's protecting the tenants, right? And so we see this continue. There's bound to come a point of collapse if we can't change that. And I don't know how you change it without mandatory minimum wage, which, by the way, is now got to be above $15 an hour to catch up with the rate of inflation and the rate of housing increases.
Yeah, and I think, too, like, I was reading about, I forget what city, that they are now criminalizing, sleeping on,
yes,
like, under overpasses. So not only
yes,
are you dealing with people that are housing insecure, but now you're criminalizing them, and now they have criminal records and can't get jobs.
Right. And not only that, but arresting them for sleeping outside when there's nowhere else for them to go, right? So we create these ordinances where certain places you can't sleep, right? And then I don't know if you've seen those park benches or things that have like spikes on them, so you can't lay down. It's draconian. There are actually laws about where you can sit in a lot of cities now that are intended specifically to hurt people who are unhoused. And what is the point of that? The point of that is that property owners, and let's be honest, mostly white, wealthy property owners, don't want to see poor people when they look outside their front window, when they drive down the street. And so that's who's in charge of society and has the politicians in their hands, so they call the politicians and say, get the police to come get these people out of the park. And then where do they take them? They take them to a temporary location where everybody's forced in together. It's an extremely dangerous situation, especially with COVID. And they're told, even though they've done nothing wrong except be poor, that they can't leave. They're trapped. And then it's like, what's the difference between that and a prison? So the criminalization of the poor is a part of the problem as well. The criminalization of the unhoused. And it's very, very, it's very disarming and alarming. As a person of faith, as a person who hears Jesus talking about caring for the poor, loving the poor, I think we have to think through what it means for us as a church, as a people, to stand against laws like that criminalize poor people, and find more humane ways to create housing security. All the innovative ideas that we come up with, they sound great at first, but then when you require somebody to come into the housing, first they're taken there by police from the park where they want to be, because they don't want to go into the place that you're taking them. You tell them that they have to be sober and they can't drink any alcohol or do drugs. If you told me that, I would be in the park, right? You told me I can't have beer, I'm in the park. And then you tell me that I can't leave from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. That's inhumane. That's a prison. That's not a housing. That's a prison. It's just a light prison, right? And then now we hear all these ideas. Oh, we're going to build them tiny houses. Well, I don't even know about this, but the places where they built tiny houses, first of all, the tiny houses are smaller than what the government requires a cell to be in a prison. And they make more than one person live in it, in these tiny houses. That tiny house isn't the answer either, right? The answer to the affordable housing crisis is better wages and more jobs, right? That's the answer. you can build all the affordable housing you want, and we're like 20 years behind, 45,000 units from where we need to be, 60,000 units from where we need to be. We'll never make it up. That's billions of dollars. We're not going to make that up. You're going to have to come up with some other, some other strategy, some other policy to change the lot for poor folks.
Yeah, for sure. Ben, I think you're the one that needs to run for office.
No. You need to run. I'm a pastor. I'm just a lowly pastor.
I think, too, one thing that really resonated with me is the power of our stories. And there's a book I read, it's called $2 a Day, and it highlights the people that are literally living on less than $2 a day in America. But kind of the flip side of that, sometimes I wonder if the way stories are told can actually be hurtful and harmful.
Yes.
And especially when stories are told for people. So specifically, when we hear that the LGBTQ plus communities are being called groomers, and that's the narrative that they're running with. And, people are, and the narrative that poor people are trying to mooch off the government and things like that. So I wonder if you can kind of speak to where we find that balance between the need to tell stories and the need to make sure that people's voices are heard without actually doing more harm by telling those kinds of stories.
Okay, that's a great question. I think that's what I was trying to do with the parable. So let me start there. This parable has been told, as you mentioned, the same way for a long time. It's about stewardship. It's about investing your money. And if you want to, it's basically, a parable about, working hard with what you have, investing what you have, giving, and then it'll multiply. And so it becomes this sort of parable about stewardship, which I know the church loves to use and is manipulative about oftentimes. And then, or it's a parable about investments and business and trading, and it's the capitalist's favorite parable, of course. But the way it's told, the way it's situated in the Gospels makes it almost impossible to interpret it that way. So right before this parable in Luke is the story of Zacchaeus. The wee little man who went up the tree and all that. Well, Zacchaeus was defrauding people, exploiting people as a tax collector, basically doing what the two traders in the story also were doing. Jesus comes to his house, and Zacchaeus immediately realizes he's got to change. He decides to give half of his money to the poor and to pay back everybody he's exploited fourfold of what he took from them. And Jesus says, and he uses the word literally, he says, salvation, zoso, the word for salvation through the whole Bible, salvation has come to this house as a response. So Zacchaeus gets salvation, he gets saved, not because he prayed for Jesus to come into his heart, but because he made a change economically with his money, how he spent his money, who he gave his money to the poor, and to make reparations, right? Then Jesus tells this parable, and it says, to those who have, more will be given, and to those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. Now, wait a second. That can't be an example story. Then, right after this, immediately after he tells this parable, he goes to Jerusalem and turns over the banks, and then gets killed. Now, you can't have the turning of the tables and Zacchaeus as the bookends, and then this story being about going out there and making money. Because it just doesn't work with what Jesus has been saying for the last 3 years of his ministry. It just doesn't work. So something else must be happening here. And I think the key, that's why I tried to say the key is really, he's saying we're getting close to Jerusalem. So Jesus tells this story. And I do think there's a way of reading this parable, it may not be the only way, where Jesus is the third servant in the story, standing against. And the reaper becomes sort of this metaphorical character for the exploitative economic system that's crushing the people who are Jesus' followers, the poor, the peasants. And so he decides, I'm not going to participate. I'll take what you gave me, and I'll just give it right back to you. I'll bury it in the ground. I don't care. I don't care that you're king, that you're killing people, that you reap where you did not sow. Sorry, but I have to stand against this. And that's a different way of reading the parable, very different. In fact, it's the opposite way of reading the parable than traditionally. So what I was trying to say is that sometimes we need to take old stories and reread them in new ways, because we can tell stories in ways that end up affirming the status quo of our society and don't provide what Jesus would provide to it, which is a critique and a new way, a new path, a path of love and inclusivity. And so I think when it comes to stories in the world, so the human mind wants to make meaning. But when the meaning that it's trying to make of a story is too painful, the truth is too hard to digest, because we can only handle so much truth as human beings. Our whole life is trying to expand how much truth we can receive. We get to a point where we can't handle the truth of it. We spin the story into a lie because we need meaning. So we're gonna find a way to tell the story, and then we can tell the story in such a way that it becomes a lie. So there's a danger, to your point, where we take a story that's maybe totally benign or have a really positive moral, and we flip it and turn it in a way where it becomes dangerous and violent and harmful, and not what Jesus would have wanted us to hear. And I think that's what we've done with this parable, but I think it's what we do with a lot of stories, throughout American history. I see people using Martin Luther King this way all the time now. It's like, well, Martin Luther King said, God loves everybody, and so you shouldn't be talking about race. Wait, what? That's all he talked about. Oh, it's divisive. King said we're all one. So no, that's not what he said. But it's a way of taking the story of a person and manipulating it to feed our own desires for not having to hear about things.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that kind of segues into this question, which says, more broadly, why did Jesus tell that parable, and what would the people who heard it have gotten out of it? And I think kind of when I read this question, what I think of is, wouldn't it have been easier for Jesus to have just said what he meant instead of telling a story and leaving it open for interpretation?
Yes. So why didn't Jesus just say, and here's the interpretation of the story? So he only interprets parables like one time. Usually he ends with like a quippy phrase, the last shall be first, the first shall be last, end scene, drop the mic, walk away, or ask some kind of question. He interprets the parable of the sower. That's the one we get the interpretation of, which he says is a parable about parables. So thanks, Jesus. So we got a parable about parables, and then we have his interpretation. But we don't have the interpretation of a lot of them. It's sort of like Emily Dickinson said, tell the truth, but tell it slant, right? If you can come in sideways with people, you can maybe disarm them enough where they can hear more truth than they ordinarily would. Like most of the time when you're giving somebody a truth like, did you know whiteness isn't real, it's an ideology? They're like, what? They can't handle it. But if you told a story, you come in sideways, now they're like, huh. And then they remember the story, and they can think about the story, and its meaning can develop over time, and they can think about it. Whereas just a statement is so shocking sometimes. And he gives some shocking statements, right? He said, cut your hand off if it leads you to sin. Sometimes I think he was being hyperbolic, right? But I think he said shocking statements, but he also told these stories to try to get at it, to come in sideways, and to see if people would be open to it. And then to leave them with it, not to try to over-explain it, because if he explained it, then he's still giving them the shock. Yeah. The other thing that he's doing is he's protecting himself. So just like the book of Revelation is all written in code so that John and the disciples would not get executed by the Roman Empire, Jesus is telling parables in front of the scribes and Pharisees and people who might go back and talk to the scribes and Pharisees and report on him, so that nobody can really say, well, I heard him say that Caesar is not Lord and we should kill him, or that the temple, that he's going to come into the temple and turn over the money changers, so we need to stop him. He tells parables instead to protect himself so he can keep going in ministry, and as riddles, almost like as a way of getting at something. And also there's a mystery about God, and there's a mystery about human nature that you really can't capture in a statement, that you have to do with story. So it's frustrating, but it's also, I think that's what Jesus had to do.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So our next question says, why did Jesus take this phrase, whoever has been given more, from Luke 8, chapter 8, verse 18, which seems to be about the reception of truth and the riddle of parables? Why did Jesus put it in the mouth of the harsh rules, talking about his accumulation of wealth?
Yeah, I think, so Jesus also says, to whom much is given, much is required, right? That may seem like a similar statement in relationship to the reaper in this story makes at the end. But the reaper is saying, to those who have been given much, more will be given. And to those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. Now, I've seen pastors and scholars get to the end of doing a stewardship sermon and try to deal with that line and fumble and fumble and fumble. What do you do with that? How is that stewardship? Right? How is that stewardship? To those who have been given much, more will be given, and those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. What? You know, that it doesn't make sense unless he's saying, this is the way the world works. And you want to be the third servant who stands against it.
Yeah.
It doesn't work, honestly. It doesn't comport with other teachings of Jesus about money. It doesn't work with the camel in the eye of the needle. It doesn't work with the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. It doesn't work with the parable of the rich fool. It doesn't work with blessed are the poor. It just doesn't work. But if you see it as Jesus saying, this is the way of the world, the coming out of the mouth of the king. See, a lot of times Jesus tells a parable and then he has a little quippy phrase. But he leaves it in the mouth of the king here. It's not his words. Usually he'd finish the parable and he would say, such is the kingdom of God, or the least shall be first. He doesn't say that here, right? And that's why, also I said the lead-in isn't the kingdom of God is like. When he tells the parable of the mustard seed or some of the other, he says the kingdom of God is like. He's doing a metaphor. He's telling you the kingdom of God is like this. He doesn't say that at the beginning of this one. So it's not about the kingdom.
Yeah.
Right? It's something else.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like, especially like prosperity, pastors really try to kind of exploit that in some ways, that like if you give everything that you have,
Yes.
then you'll get something in return, and it just seems like a way to sort of exploit people that
Yes.
have already been.
The prayer of Jabez, multiplication principle, word faith theology. I could go on and on about all the prosperity parts of this. The Bible doesn't really give that as much as people imagine it. This idea that it does say that if you put your resources in the right place, that it may benefit you in some way. But it doesn't mean that you're going to heaven, and it doesn't mean that you're going to get more. More often it says, if you want to be blessed, give it to the poor, or give it all to the poor. I mean, right, this is the constant concern for widows and orphans that happens throughout the entire Hebrew Bible. And then in Jesus. Now, I know that the Hebrew Bible is also filled with stories that, are violent and vicious and all this other stuff. The way I read the Bible is I want to pick up on what Jesus picked up on. What parts of his tradition did he carry, and which ones did he let go? Jesus never quotes from the book of Judges. He never quotes from Joshua. There are many places Jesus never references. But what does he reference? Isaiah, Psalms, Exodus, Deuteronomy is what he uses to combat the devil in the wilderness, right? And the Psalms. He never quotes from Joshua or Judges. He rarely mentions, this slaughtering back and forth of all the kings in 1st and 2nd Kings and Samuel. Pay attention to what Jesus is carrying. He's made a decision about what parts of his tradition he's going to carry forward. And we have the same task. Yeah. We inherited a Christianity that is filled with thousands of years of colonialism, slavery, and violence, and patriarchy, and a whole bunch of other things. We don't have to carry all that forward. We can leave some of that behind. Just like Jesus left behind parts of Judaism that he didn't feel like he wanted to carry with him going forward. Stories that he didn't think were powerful. So there's some stories we just need to let go and stop telling and move on and focus on ones that we feel like are going to help us to navigate the difficult crises that we face as people.
Yeah, for sure. So this next question, I'm actually going to ask if you can come to the mic. Beth, I think you gave this to me because I'm not really good at reading cursive. So do you mind coming to the mic and reading your question?
Is this Beth?
Yeah.
Beth, would you come and ask your question at the mic? You want to give it back to her?
Yeah,
maybe?
yeah.
Could it be with what you know that this scripture, as it was interpreted at the time, would be the basis for what was called the Declaration of Discovery, especially that last sentence where it calls on having people slaughtered? And I think that the Declaration of Discovery still affects us today.
Yes, yeah. Well, we had Mark Charles here during the pandemic, who is an indigenous theologian and scholar who talks about the Doctrine of Discovery, which was a Catholic papal bull that said Christians who would like to go out and explore the world may go, and if they find lands and resources, if the people there are not Christian, you can kill them and remove them. So this was a Catholic doctrine, a papal bull, and it led to, of course, Columbus and many, many other explorers going around and doing exactly that, and how we got to where we are today. It also led to centuries of anti-indigenous sentiment and the idea that indigenous people and their traditions and religions were less than human, or primitive, is another way to put that. And that somehow Western European Christianity, which was, in my definition, I would say BS, not Christianity at all, is somehow superior to indigenous religious traditions and indigenous people. And that Western European society and all the values of Western European society are better than indigenous people and their religious traditions and their spirituality. Turns out that was totally wrong, right? We're living now at a time where everybody's trying to figure out how to go back and live in sustainable relationship with the earth, with the environment, right? We've lost all the wisdom of the indigenous people because we slaughtered them, imagining that our way of guns and buildings and sewage and all that was better. You know, civilization, we called it, was better. Civilization was a desert of slaughtered bodies, dead people. So the Doctrine of Discovery is extremely important to understanding. By the way, it is referenced by the American Supreme Court multiple times to defend the indigenous removal and genocide out west. So it is a part of American jurisprudence that continues to be appealed to. This doctrine that indigenous people are less than human, and if they are not Christian, can be removed. So it's appealed to constantly, which you'll find out at law school. Yeah, you'll see that. And so what about this passage? Beth says the last line could be a justification for indigenous, genocide, murder, the Doctrine of Discovery. It's interesting that the first 1,000 years of Christianity, the primary way of interpreting this parable is wildly allegorical. Christians didn't interpret it very materialistically, and they certainly didn't think of it in terms of like riches, that they were going to, like prosperity, they're going to get riches if they invest more money. It was more like, where is God in there? Who is Jesus? You know, and they interpreted it spiritually or allegorically for about 1,000 years. And only after that, in the wake of historical criticism and after the medieval period, did things start to shift. The real shift of what we now know, what we've heard this parable interpreted, came in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution. At that time, capitalists and preachers who were really proud of their capitalist members who were supporting them financially got together and really focused on this parable as a way of driving productivity and labor and saying, if you make that investments and trading were good, right? And most of the time they appeal to the Matthew version because the version in Luke is much harder to justify. Because if you can see already in Luke, they don't do this in Matthew. Halfway into the parable, you get this little line that says, and the citizens hated this guy. Wait, what's that? Is that God? They hated God? No, they hated Jesus. That's not the story. Something else is going on here, right? That's not in Matthew. So they take the Matthew version, which comes in Matthew 25, and they turn it into this parable about either stewardship or productivity. Labor is most of it. You should work hard. You should go to the coal mine, work 25 hours a day and on hot floors and die and kill yourself for the sake of us building this railroad, building this factory, making steel, whatever, right? And so the Industrial Revolution really shifts and changes the direction of this parable pretty radically. And I think we have to keep that in mind. So I don't know that people were using it as justification for the doctrine of discovery, but I could see how you could look at the slaughter, the violence against enemies, and if you're already thinking God is the master and Jesus is the king in this story, very easy to say, well, Jesus is okay with us slaughtering our enemies. God's okay with us slaughtering our enemies. It's right here in this parable. Again, a story that we've taken the wrong direction.
Exactly, and it happens, unfortunately, very often where,
All the time.
you know, stories are read one way and then something happens and it all of a sudden it gets read another way. I don't want to go too much over time, but I guess we have time for one quick question if someone wants to come to the mic.
Awesome.
Well, first off, let me just say this is a really fantastic idea. I think so often it's so easy to hear a great sermon and be like, oh, that was great, and then you get distracted by whatever's happening Sunday, you get distracted by the next week, and then you're back here. So to have this thing where you just intentionally think about what you've just heard before it goes out of your head with your grocery list is just really a beautiful thing. And so that leads me into my question, in that I think so often, you know, I was raised in church, been very active at church pretty much my whole life, but I think so often, you know, because of those distractions, like you can have a great church service and then you say to each other, all right, same time, same place next week, and it's like, absolutely, but there's a whole lot of time in between Sundays. What would you say, you know, to us, to anyone, is the best way for us to take your wonderful words from today's sermon and bring it out into the world on days that aren't Sunday?
All right, good, yeah. And I'm really grateful for your family being here, all the way from Atlanta, by the way. So I hope you all will get a chance to meet them. Have been watching us online since March of 2020 and are now here up from Atlanta for the first time in person with us. Drove from Atlanta today. So thank you all for coming. Really appreciate being here. Just let that sink into you about what the future of church is like, and what may be the future of Myers Park Baptist. Wow. So yeah, Monday's coming, right? And we got to figure out how to live this story. First, I would say let me give a lot of things. I have a lot of things. One is to be more suspicious about stories that you're hearing, whether it be on the news, especially if they're the familiar, tired, same old story, and say, wait a second, maybe there's a different way to think about that story, you know? And so that's the first thing. Be suspicious of stories that confirm the status quo of our world and don't provide any challenge or new direction. The second, for me, would be to think through how you might be like the third servant or Jesus and interrupt the regular flow of the economic, you know, every day of our lives, which just seems to be a never-ending, fatalistic nightmare. I'm looking at Seth because he knows about my nightmares. You know, it's just like a nightmare. And I think we can interrupt that by doing things that would be surprising, you know? Giving a ridiculous tip to a day worker who is working at, you know, wherever, pick a restaurant, you know? Actually, you know, I know that everybody says don't give money to people on the streets, but why the hell not? Carry some cash in your car and just give it away and give ridiculous amounts. Who cares what they're going to do with it? Who cares? Just do it. Be generous, right? Pay your people more money. If you're an employer, if you have people under you, pay them more. Pay fair wages. You know, this year, what would a cost of living increase look like in a year where inflation is at 8%? So if you have people under your employment, pay them more. You know, I think be mindful of how you treat people who are poor. And you know who they are. You know who they are. Go into it with an affirmation of their humanity and their dignity. That's your primary goal. Not to be engaged in a relationship of service where they're providing something for you or they're less than you or you feel so sorry for them. No. affirm their dignity. That's what Jesus did. You don't see Jesus ever feel sorry for poor people. He felt sorry for the chief priests and scribes a lot. But when he sees the poor, he just sees the image of God over and over again. He's drawn to it. He wants to be with them, and he wants to affirm them. And he wants to break down whatever social boundaries are holding them trapped in an impoverished situation, anything that's hurting them. So maybe just be mindful for this week, between here and next week, when you see poor people and your relationships with them. How can you show up and be light and love and an affirmation of their dignity? Instead of, and in doing so, maybe you interrupt the onslaught of being treated as less than for them that they get. Maybe you interrupt this economic system that seems to criminalize the homeless and the poor. And then maybe we all, after we take this week of doing that, think about what the church should do together. I'm open. You come tell me. I'll do what you say. You tell me what to do. I don't know. I don't know the answer, so I'm hoping that you all will come up with some good stuff.
Yeah, well, what a great way to end with a nice call to action that will definitely kind of disrupt our daily flow of, just kind of going on autopilot. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Devin.
An amazing sermon. And thank you, everyone, for being here. Yeah. Good job. Thank you. Y'all have a great Sunday.